Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're tackling a figure who's undeniably brilliant, occasionally baffling, and always fascinating. Bertrand Russell. You've sent over quite the stack of excerpts on him. Seems like you're interested in the whole philosophical roller coaster ride, from his early life to his work on logic, and even his activism.
And that's what makes Russell so compelling. He refused to be confined to just one box. He was a mathematician, a philosopher, a social activist, a true polymath who believed in tackling big questions both inside and outside the academic world.
Exactly. So before we get to the mind-bending paradoxes, let's start with Russell the person. Born in 1872 to an aristocratic family, he had a front-row seat to the world of politics and ideas. His grandfather, after all, was prime minister.
It's hard to overstate how much that environment shaped his thinking. Imagine those family dinners. Debates about politics, ethics, the nature of reality. It's no wonder he grew up with such a strong sense of social responsibility and a passion for rigorous debate.
You've got a point. But then he lands at Cambridge and things really start to sizzle. Rubbing shoulders with intellectual powerhouses like G.E. Moore and Alfred North Whitehead must have been like philosophical boot camp.
It was a pivotal time for Russell and for philosophy in general. This was the era when analytic philosophy was emerging, a movement that aimed to bring laser-like precision to philosophical arguments, using logic and rigorous analysis to cut through the fog.
Okay, hold on. Analytic philosophy. For those of us who haven't spent much time in philosophy departments, could you unpack that a bit? What's so revolutionary about applying logic to philosophy? Isn't that what philosophers have always done?
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But before analytic philosophy, many philosophical arguments relied heavily on intuition tradition or even just flowery language. Analytic philosophers like Russell wanted to change that. They believed that by using logic like mathematicians do, they could build arguments that were as clear and irrefutable as a mathematical proof.
So it's like taking a microscope to philosophical concepts, examining them under the bright light of logic. I could see that could shake things up.
Precisely. And no work embodies this ambition more than Russell and Whitehead's Principia Mathematica. This 3-volume behemoth was nothing less than an attempt to rebuild all of mathematics from the ground up, using only the purest logic as their foundation. Talk about ambition.
Whoa, reconstructing all of math with just logic? Did they pull it off? It sounds like they bit off more than they could chew.
It's a mixed bag, honestly. They made incredible progress, and Principia Mathematica is still considered a landmark achievement. But as they were building this grand mathematical edifice, brick by logical brick, they stumbled upon a crack in the foundation. A paradox so mind-boggling it shook the world of mathematics.
A paradox. Now you have to tell me more. Does this just some abstract mathematical puzzle, or did it have real-world implications?
Oh, it had implications far beyond the ivory tower. Imagine this. You have sets, right? Like a set of all cats, a set of all planets, a set of all ideas. Some sets contain themselves, for instance, the set of all things humans have thought of. Well, that set is itself a thing humans have thought of. But then there are sets that don't contain themselves. Like the set of all cats isn't itself a cat, it's a set.
Right. I'm following so far, I think.
Now, Russell asks this deceptively simple question. What about the set of all sets that don't contain themselves? Does that set contain itself? If it does, it shouldn't, because it's supposed to be the set of sets that don't contain themselves. But if it doesn't contain itself, it should, because it fits the definition.
Oh, my brain just did a loop-de-loop. I can see why they call it a paradox. But this wasn't just some philosophical brain teaser, right? What were the consequences of this Russell's paradox thing?
This wasn't just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, it was hitting the iceberg. It showed that set theory, which mathematicians thought was this perfectly logical system, could actually lead to contradictions. It meant that some of the most fundamental assumptions about math might be flawed. This wasn't just a mathematical problem. It had huge implications for logic and the very foundations of how we understand the world.
I bet that discovery went down like a lead balloon in the math world. It's like realizing the ground beneath your feet isn't solid after all.
Exactly. But Russell wasn't done shaking things up. He then turned his attention to language, another seemingly solid system ripe for scrutiny. And this is where his theory of descriptions comes in.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
It's all about how we use language to refer to things in the world, things that may or may not actually exist. His favorite example is this. The present king of France is bald.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. Spoiler alert. There is no present king of France, so how can we even talk about him bald or otherwise?
Exactly. Russell argued that sentences like this are tricky because they seem to refer to something that doesn't exist. But instead of picturing a bald king on a throne, we need to break the sentence down. It's not really about a specific king, but about the concept of a king of France, which happens to be empty.
So it's like talking about unicorns or dragons. We can describe them, tell stories about them, even draw pictures. But that doesn't mean they magically pop into existence in some stable or mythical cave.
That's a great way to put it. Russell's theory of descriptions helps us see how language allows us to discuss concepts and ideas, even those that don't have a physical reality. And this might seem like a minor point, but it has huge implications for how we understand language, meaning truth. Everything.
It's like realizing the words we use every day have these hidden trap doors leading to deeper philosophical questions. It makes you wonder what other linguistic landmines are lurking out there. But for someone so obsessed with logic and the precise use of language, Russell was remarkably engaged with the messy, illogical world around him. He wasn't content to just sit in his ivory tower, was he?
Not in the slightest. He famously said, "The world is full of magical things patiently waiting for our senses to grow sharper." And Russell's senses were definitely sharp, not just for intellectual puzzles, but for human struggles, too. Remember, this is a man who was deeply troubled by World War I, a conflict that shattered the idea of inevitable progress and reason that many intellectuals clung to.
And that's where his activism comes in, right?
Yeah.
This wasn't just some abstract moral philosophy for Russell. He put his beliefs into action, often facing real consequences.
Absolutely. Take his pacifism during World War I, for example. He was one of the few voices, especially in academia, who dared to speak out against it. He believed war was morally wrong and ultimately futile, and he wasn't afraid to say it even when it meant risking his career, his reputation, and even his freedom.
And he did risk it all. He was ostracized, lost his teaching position at Cambridge, for a time even faced the possibility of prison. It's mind-boggling to think about the courage it must have taken to stand up for his beliefs so publicly, especially when they were so unpopular.
And his commitment to peace extended far beyond World War I. He remained a vocal critic of war and violence throughout his life, later campaigning against nuclear proliferation and advocating for disarmament, especially during the Cold War when the threat of nuclear annihilation was palpable.
He even co-authored the Russell-Einstein Manifesto with, Albert Einstein, urging world leaders to recognize the existential threat of nuclear weapons and find peaceful solutions to international conflict. It's incredible to think about these two titans of the 20th century coming together to use their influence for such a critical cause.
It speaks volumes about Russell's character that he wasn't just content with theoretical pronouncements. He understood that real change required action courage and a willingness to challenge the status quo, even when it was uncomfortable.
It's inspiring, really. He shows us that intellectual rigor doesn't have to be at odds with compassion and social responsibility. You can be a world-renowned philosopher, a logician wrestling with paradoxes, and still be deeply moved by human suffering and committed to making the world a better place.
And for Russell, that commitment extended beyond war and peace. He was a passionate advocate for social justice, a firm believer in individual liberty and freedom of thought. He wrote extensively about education, ethics, political reform, and the importance of creating a more just and equitable society.
It's almost as if his work on logic and language fueled his activism. He saw so clearly the dangers of fuzzy thinking, dogma, and manipulation, the ways in which language itself can be used to justify injustice and oppression.
Precisely. He saw how easily people, even brilliant people, could be swayed by emotionally charged rhetoric or fall into the trap of blind ideology. He believed that reason evidence and a willingness to engage in open-minded debate were the best weapons against tyranny in all its forms.
Which makes his legacy feel incredibly relevant today, wouldn't you say? I mean, we're bombarded with misinformation, opinions disguised as facts. It's easy to feel overwhelmed and retreat into our own echo chambers.
It's true. We live in a world where it's easier than ever to surround ourselves with people who agree with us, to avoid challenging conversations, to let algorithms curate our realities. But Russell reminds us that real progress, both personal and societal, requires us to engage with the different perspectives, even uncomfortable ones, to question our own assumptions and to be willing to change our minds.
Easier said than done sometimes. But it's like he's urging us to approach the world with both curiosity and skepticism, to hold our beliefs lightly, but hold on to our principles tightly.
Exactly. And that's not always comfortable. It takes courage to admit when we're wrong, to have our beliefs challenged, to embrace nuance and complexity. But that's the path to true understanding, to building a more just and compassionate world.
A world that Russell sadly is no longer here to see. Which leads me to a final, somewhat daunting thought. If he were alive today, what would he say about the state of the world? What would keep him up at night?
Oh, I imagine he'd have plenty to say. Given his stance on war, I think he'd be deeply troubled by the ongoing conflicts and violence we see around the world. He'd likely be a vocal critic of the rise of authoritarianism, the erosion of democratic values, the increasing polarization of societies.
And the climate crisis, no doubt. The way we're treating our planet, the short-sightedness, the greed, the lack of collective action, I think it would break his heart.
And yet, I don't think he'd give in to despair. He'd remind us that we've faced seemingly insurmountable challenges before, that human history is full of examples of progress and regression, of hope and heartbreak.
So where does that leave us? What can we take away from Russell's life and work besides a healthy dose of existential dread?
I think his most important message is one of empowerment through reason and compassion. He'd urge us to not be bystanders in our own lives, to use our voices and actions to create a better future, to never underestimate the power of ideas to change the world, but also to remember that ideas without action are like seeds that have never been planted.
To paraphrase one of his most famous quotes, "Love is wise, hatred is foolish." He reminds us that progress isn't inevitable, that we have to fight for it every single day. And that's a fight worth having, even if the outcome is uncertain.
Absolutely. It's about embracing the complexities of the world while holding on to hope, compassion, and that relentless pursuit of a more just and peaceful future.
A future where, as Russell dreamed, the world is full of magical things, patiently waiting for our senses to grow sharper. And on that inspiring note, we'll leave you to ponder the possibilities. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of Bertrand Russell, a thinker who continues to challenge, inspire, and provoke us even decades after his death.